Hello and welcome to Aspects of Writing. I'm your host, James Kelly. My panelists for today's show are Vicki-Ann Bush and Janet Corsi. Joining us in the studio is Alan Geik. And Alan, you used to be on the radio, so we're going to talk about that in a few minutes as well. We're also being joined by Messenger with Cher Chidzey. Is it Chidzey?
Chidzey,
right.
yes.
Yeah, she's actually in Melbourne, Australia. So we're going to be talking about writing about cultural differences. If I can get this together. Okay. We're going to start with our guest, Cher Chidzey. You're quoting as having said, "Let's talk about harmony in our multicultural society. Let's discuss the ways of accepting differences, questioning ourselves about our prejudices, and working on them." This gives us a hint of who you are, Cher, and I just wanted you to give us a little bit about your background and about the book you wrote called Ken's Quest. So let's start off by talking about your background.
Ken's Quest.
Yes.
Ken's Quest. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. I came from Singapore. I'm from a family of 19 children.
19?
My father was born at 19.
Wow.
Yeah, my father was born at the end of the Qin dynasty. He had a pigtail in China, in the fishing village. So when the Japanese attacked China, he and his wife and the children migrated to Singapore. And I was born in a household of over 30 people in the house built on stilts. It's called the House of the 99 Closed Doors.
Oh, because that's another book you wrote, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And so, there's too many people. So I came to Australia to study. I ran away. In 1974, I studied in a high school in Sandringham in Australia, in Melbourne. And that was where my political education began with my classmate Harviva. She told me about all the political parties and this and that, and so yes, I had a lot to learn, and I was it seemed as if all my Christmas came at once. Anyway, so from then I got quite political. I joined street marches and all that sort of thing. But I'm proud in having moved from a strict Confucius sort of upbringing into Catholicism at home, and then into involvement in seeking social justice. I'm very proud of that.
Yes.
And I got married. Got married to a white Aussie, and I lived both cultures. So what did I do? At uni and whatever, I got a scholarship and completed my MSc in meteorology in Melbourne Uni.
Okay.
Are your bones aching? If your bones are aching, it's going to rain. So I taught mathematics in Victoria University, and to TAFE students, and I conducted workshops and published 3 maths books before changing my career in year 2000, when I became a writer. I self-published A House of 999 in 2007, and then I've written lots of stories and short stories, and they're published in literary journals and all sorts of things. In 2016, 3 Kookaburras published Ken's Quest. This one.
Yeah. Now, what is Kids Quest? Now, Cher, do you have a mic? Are you speaking into a mic?
No, I don't have a mic.
Oh, okay. All right.
Is it clear enough?
Yeah, sometimes it's the audible is a little different, but that's okay. We're all right. So anyway, with Ken's Quest, where did this story idea for Ken's Quest come from?
Well, yes, I wrote Ken's Quest for a very good reason. I mean, there are so many stories written about migrants, about how they get here, how they seek wealth and got rich and whatever. But I'm more interested in something else. I gathered, but there are so few authors that have written about prejudices and difficulties migrants had to face about either in the workplace or in the cross-cultural relationships. So, and I've seen all the undercurrents, having lived both cultures.
Well, yeah, because you're in Australia now, so there had to be a huge difference between moving from Singapore to Australia and then having a family that was from Japan. So you really have gone through a lot of cultural diversity.
Yes, I had to do a lot of transition myself. I had to have my eyes open and my mind open to survive because I cannot impose those values on my children
Right.
the way my parents brought me up. It's impossible. So I get that harmony in society is only achievable if more people are at ease with about other cultures. Laws only control people's outward behavior. They don't have power over people's thought. I still witness racial microaggressions. We know those terms, don't we? Micro assaults, micro insults, micro invalidation. On a daily basis, lots of people go through that.
Right.
And I say, we can do better, much better than that. So, and I've witnessed the consequence of the build-up of these undercurrents. So people say, I'm not going to speak up because I'm scared of being labeled racist. So I'm going to keep quiet, but I'm not happy. I'm not happy. And all that sort of thing built up to a stage where we had the Cronulla riots in Sydney in 2005.
Really?
And yes, there were riots. I mean, Australia, we don't have that many here. We have it here and there. And we have the Pauline Hanson One Nation Party. Right. So I wrote King's Quest to encourage reflections on our assumptions about other cultures. We are manipulated by our tribal voice. And what is cultural voice? The cultural imprinting that overlays our actions and reactions throughout life. Sometimes our tribal voice tells us the wrong assumptions, and the media beats it up to create racial tension as well. So scrutinizing ourselves, scrutinizing what the media say, so that we can have clear critical thinking as well as harmony within ourselves. So how do I structure these cultural differences into King's Quest? I took three aspects of it. First, the work culture. So I created a person called Kang, a Shanghainese engineer who came to Australia on a fake passport. Why was it fake? Because his qualification wasn't recognized yet in the 1990s, and he was too old to come on a working holiday visa. So he used his cousin's identity to come here. So he came here with a lot of expectations. I'm senior, I'm engineer, I have to be respected. But did he get that? Nah. Especially, there is a xenophobic assistant called Red. Red was his arch enemy. Red hate foreigners because he came from a background that was fragmented. He grew up in a single parent family that moved from place to place, and he was bitter about foreigners coming to, and fearful. That kind of fear of displacement has never been written about. I think we have to talk about that because
Yes.
it is very important. It sits in here, and then it brews and brews. Okay, so at the workplace, what is it that is not quite right? He said that I'm an engineer. You should respect me. Did anybody respect him? No, you're too snobbish. We'll take you down. and growing up in communist China, he's got a top-heavy approach. You listen to what I say. Although he didn't get anywhere, he was just a foreman. But even that, he tries to pull his weight. You listen to me. He report Red to his boss instead of talking to him. And that's totally wrong. The Aussies, people here are egalitarian. They don't like, you discuss your and resolve your issues. You don't report up there, okay? And he's got bad attitude towards socializing because growing up during the Cultural Revolution means he's scared. The Cultural Revolution has created a generation of people to mistrust, to say very little in case someone stabs me in the back.
Right.
So, and there, so he's just totally insecure. He's just, I'm not going to have as, and it's not important to have small talk. No, well, this is all he's talking about. They talk about sports all the time. What does that mean? Why don't they look into your career? No, he doesn't understand the work dynamics, so he gets into trouble. Okay, so we talk about his assistant Red, who who hates foreigners. Why does he hate foreigners? He thinks that the migrants are coming here to take his job. Migrants jumped queues. They deprive him of his mother and him government housing. In the past, it was a Viet. Now,
Uh-oh.
Cher, I think we lost you. We'll probably get you back here in just a minute. We
jobs,
use
especially from poverty-stricken white Aussies. Foreign food, foreign music, foreign arts, foreign are displacing Aussies. It's bad. It's the end of his identity as a white person. But he's not the only one saying that. He has been encouraged. His fear of displacement reached far back to the gold rush days. So the Chinese miners were treated like scums. Okay, we just have to look at the massacre, Chinese massacre in Lemming Flats, and we have famous people like Jeffrey Blaney. Know Jeffrey Blaney? He is a famous Australian historian. He's got quite international audience. So he presented Asians as a threat to jobs, to housing. So, and the media beats it up. Doesn't help.
so Cher.
Another aspect of, yeah.
So I understand that it's all about cultural differences. So Ken's Quest is a fictional story that deals with the different prejudices.
Correct. I want to show I'm like a surgeon going into the brains, showing their fears. It's only that one embraces and acknowledges one's fear, then one can move forward.
Okay.
One can come up and speak honestly about how you feel. What don't I like about this? For example, I met up with a friend, a co-worker at the neighborhood house, and she said to me, "Oh, sure, I know someone who was a Singaporean. You know, why do they always have to be at the top of the queue, grab the best part of the meal, and so on and so on and so on?" And I stood there and I looked at her, and I said, "Hey, why are you telling?" I was thinking, "Why are you telling me this? I know we have a term called kiasu in Singapore, afraid to lose. And yes, we are right. We are a small island nation with no resources, natural resources.
Mm-hmm.
We're therefore anxious. Okay, if she would have said, "Sure, I've got the problem of this go energy of Singaporeans," I might sit down and speak with her. Instead, you know what I did? I went home and got angry for the next 3 years. How silly. I didn't open up and talk. So these undercurrents is there, these bad feelings. This is what I intended in Ken's Quest, is to get people to not fear and speak up, to reflect on what they assume it might not be right at all. So these undercurrents can stop.
Cher, is there a lot of you in Ken then? Do you see that is your voice?
That's my voice. But I've told that many migrants is a combination of their voices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I see in trams people get shouted at. The microaggression goes on, regardless of what. Yeah.
Well, and
Sorry.
we're going to be talking about all this as well. And we were actually talking before we went on air. We were waiting for Cher, and we actually had a conversation about how we do things without even realizing it, or say things that we grew up with that could be not
misinterpreted.
Yeah, misinterpreted or hurt someone's feelings when you think, well, I don't understand why it hurts their feelings. This is what we've said all my whole life. Yeah. And so that's kind of what Ken's Quest is about, is how we approach each other in different cultural. Because I've dealt with a lot of different people in writing, believe it or not, Cher, when it comes to cultural aspects. We also talked about that a little bit before we went on there. And it's interesting how from one culture to another, how we view society. I'll give you an example, Cher. I worked on a book with a lady who was from the Philippines, and I did not understand that in the Philippines, you are subordinate to your elders, and that can mean brothers and sisters. And in the book that I helped write, My Journey with the Truth, not My Journey with the Truth, what was Deep Sorrows?
Oh, God.
Yeah, it was by Sonia Leeson Cahaling. I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, in that book, what she talked about was how when she finally decided to leave and come to America, her sister forbade her. She's 22, and her sister would not let her date. and she was running across the street and seeing this guy across the street because she was still in college. And her little niece, who she was taking care of, that was 2, she didn't think her niece would know to say anything to her mother, told her mother about this little affair, and her mother caught her. She pulled
So
her
her mother about what? Sorry, I didn't catch that.
about having an affair with the guy across the street. She was seeing a guy across the street. They weren't doing anything. They were just meeting up and maybe kissing or something. But anyway, the little niece told on her. When her sister came home that evening and found out that she had been seeing this guy, and she questioned her, "Are you still seeing the guy across the street?" And she said yes. She proceeded to start beating her. They were outside on the porch. The crowd started gathering around in the neighborhood. This is all in her book. And she literally made her disrobe on the porch and proceeded to beat her with everything she could find on that porch. Dragged her by the hair into the house when she was falling down crying, continued to beat her in the house, and then pulled her back out on the porch and was telling everyone that was standing around there couldn't believe what was going on, calling her a whore and all this kind of stuff. This is something I didn't understand. I said, "Why did you allow her to beat you? Why didn't you try to fight back?" And she said, "It's hard to understand, but in our culture, you don't do that. You know, you are subordinate to your elders." However, that was the beating where she finally ran away. She did run away, ended up marrying the guy across the street, and they ended up coming to America. But the point is that we think in every culture it's the same. And that's why I always believe in traveling, because when you travel, you get to see different cultures and how they are. And not everything is the way it is in Australia, or the way it is in America, or the way it is in Japan, or the way it is in Singapore. Every culture is different. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about today, is understanding those cultural differences, and when you're writing, how to incorporate that into your writing to make sense. Some people wouldn't believe the story I just told you, but that really did happen.
Yeah, I've taught many migrants. So yeah, I've taught people who ran away change their names. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I have to keep my mouth shut. And inside me, I was saying, "Oh, good, run away," but I can't say that as a teacher. I can't. So that's where the difficulty is. But yes, in King's Quest 2, he's got all the wrong ideas about women, because he's from a very, very conservative Confucian background. His father was a big shot before the communists came, so he had a taste of wealth and what power is like.
Yeah.
So he's oh god, yeah. So woman must be supine while making sex in bed, that sort of thing. They must accept his advice. He must be dressed appropriate, no bikini, no nudes, no nothing. So he's got all these conservative ideas, and he's banging his brick wall when he came. Then he met Julia, his girlfriend, a TAFE teacher, teaching him speech, because his written English is good, but his talking, nobody understands him. So there you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
She put him in place.
Well, where can we learn more about your book? Where can we see is it on Amazon?
It is on Kindle, yes. Yeah,
Okay.
Amazon, yep.
All right. And now we're going to I'm going to let Vicki-Ann introduce our next guest, and then we're going to get into the panel discussion. All right?
Our next guest is Alan Geik. Alan received a master's degree from the London School of Economics in Political Science and taught at the Kingston College of Technology outside of London. Alan has been a radio host, music producer, a film editor at Paramount Pictures, and now an author and a friend. Alan co-hosted for a few months on Latin Dimensions, an Afro-Cuban music radio show at KCRW in Santa Monica, California. That led him to co-hosting Almadel Barrio, a show at KXLU in Los Angeles that has been on the air since 1972. What he thought would only be a few months with Latin Dimensions turned into 25 years at the microphone of these two shows.
Okay. All right. And you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself, Alan?
Well, that said a whole lot.
Well,
Actually, before we went on the air, I was telling you that I just found myself in both the radio show, which I thought I would do for 6 months, as Vicki mentioned, and also the job at Paramount that I was just filled in for a month, and 12 years later, I realized without missing a paycheck in 12 years, no matter that I took off months at a time, it was rather extraordinary. And my boss there is still my friend and always will be. But a lot of that translated into the story. I was Glenfiddich Inn, which I wrote and was published just a couple of years ago. But when I was in London, one of the things that really impressed me in a very tragic sort of way, that was how exhausting and how traumatic World War I was to Europe in a way it wasn't in America, because they were involved in it for 4 years and we were involved in it for about a year and a half of actually sending men over to the war. Right. And nobody expected the war to go on for more than just a few months. And in fact, it was the most dreadfully destructive war ever. Of course, World War II came along 30 years after that. But each town in Scotland and probably Ireland too, the way they drafted men into the armed forces was to take a whole town of men so that they would feel comfortable, and they call it the pals of wherever, Londonderry, the pals of all these small hamlets. And what happened was often the whole unit would be destroyed and nobody would ever come back. And this happened, I mean, the number of people who, it was just an extraordinarily traumatic event. And my story takes place in New York and Boston. At the time when all this was going on in Europe, it was a time of extraordinary technological advances, but everybody was aware of what was going on in Europe, and most people predicted that somehow the war was going to land up on our shores. And speaking of cultural differences, the Irish and the Germans were the inner city at the time. We forget that was, and both of them were very opposed to fighting for the British. And when the time came, it took a lot of propaganda to get them to actually fight on the side, the ones living in this country. But one of the other themes of the story was the technological advances. Just right before my story begins, Henry Ford developed the Model T, which changed transportation forever. People didn't have to wait for a train or a buggy ride. People could make their own schedules, and roads were being built out. And it was, when you think about it, life without a car. And there it was. And overnight, literally everything changed. And just 2 or 3 years, and one of the themes that really struck me and got me involved in that era was a few years before the story began in 1915. 3 years before that, the Titanic sank in the North Atlantic. Yep. And what they had aboard was wireless Morse code. And it was a relatively new technological advance. And before that, ships would just be lost at sea, and nobody would ever know what happened to them. But with the Titanic, they were able to send out wireless Morse code, and ships came and actually picked up the survivors, and we have the stories to this day. Yeah. It's still one, and without wireless Morse code, there would have never been any record of what happened. And the people who were involved in the electrical engineers of the time, and 2 of the fictional characters, were fascinated with the idea of throwing a voice, not just Morse code, but a real voice, and across a New England farm, maybe a mile or 2 into the winter. And to some of the people who were thinking far in advance, the idea of someone being in your living room for the first time, a guest, not someone coming in who you didn't know, but someone who you, in a sense, invited in. It was the most extraordinary cultural advance, I believe. It just changed overnight. And the early days of experimenting and trying to get this voice, and 2 of the women who, one person who reviewed the books referred to them as Katharine Hepburn types because they were so far advanced from their time in every way, the way they dressed, their ideas about morals and politics, and about this odd technology called radio.
Yes.
That was the name they gave this technology, and the government was very much afraid of it at the time because they wanted, very much like now, nothing's really changed. They wanted to control the message that was going out to the people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That went through World War II, through Vietnam, Korea, right up until today. It's a fight for the message. And being this new technology was there, they didn't know how to control that.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just one other thing, if I
Sure.
may add. The month World War I started was August 1914. And just coincidentally,
No, go ahead.
just coincidentally, a young man came from Baltimore from a work farm where he had been since he was 9 years old to play baseball. And he was signed by the Boston Red Sox. His name was George Herman Ruth. But he was so big and so naive that they called him Babe. And he became a metaphor because when he came to Boston, he had never seen a menu. He had never been on an elevator. He bought a bicycle with his first paycheck.
Oh, wow.
And he was just so naive that they could say almost anything to him, the older players. But by the end of the war, 4 years later, he became very adept at what everybody else was doing, fixing baseball games, gambling, living a debauched life, women. And that was sort of a metaphor for America, which entered the war as an emerging nation and ended as the world power.
Okay.
Well, everything that I'm hearing here is things that take place right here in the United States as well. You know, the cultural differences, the fears that we all have of some foreigner taking our jobs, taking our families over, you know, and integrating.
Yes, I agree.
It seems like it's just a theme that's going on throughout American history.
I was going to say, it's just a new, different set of cultural background, but the story is the same. It just gets
Yeah.
carried on
Yeah.
and on.
Yeah.
So what else are you working
I
on?
think
Go ahead, Cher.
it's wired in our brain. Primeval, it went back for thousands of years. We've always, even in the caveman stage, that people, the clans against clans, it's right within there.
Yeah.
The fear,
Yeah.
the survival thing. You're slightly different from me, so I'm scared of you.
Right.
Yeah.
It's human. It's hardwired. in
One
there.
of these days,
But
I'm
we
going to
can-
have a book out, Cher, that I'll share with you guys. I'm getting there. It's very close to being ready. That explains why we have all these cultural differences. It's called the Alien Transcripts.
Yeah.
So I'll make sure you get a copy, Cher.
You'll love it.
It'll be out
I'm
soon.
still waiting.
Yeah. So, Alan, what else are you working on? What's in your future?
Well, I had wanted to write a sequel to this because the story ended in 1919, and just the very next year, women got the right to vote.
Yeah.
Prohibition started. And
Yeah.
also there was I was always been drawn to scams because of my own background in New York City, family. Charles Ponzi, who we get the name, the Ponzi
Ponzi scheme.
That unfolded in Boston the year after my story ends. And it really was, being we all know the name, the actual way the scam unfolded was very simple. And it took in $10 million in 1920
Wow.
from a man who just thought he would make a few bucks off of it. Just a scammer who was scamming a few people.
Wow.
And before you knew it, it became the rage and ended almost overnight, a few months later. But we still know that name. But it's hard for me to actually... I started writing an outline for it, but... we all know what it's like to really write something. And,
Yes.
and when I did Glenfiddich Inn, one of the events in the book was some of the characters were on the Lusitania, which was sunk by German torpedoes in May 1915. And I said, if I do this book, the book has to be out 6 months before that date. So I really had a date hard and fast, and I lived up to it. But if I do another book, I'll just keep writing until I forget what the story is. You know, I mean, I'll just be. So I'm afraid to start something else.
Yeah, my characters take over a lot of times and get completely off script.
And
yeah,
I was amazed at that because I always heard from, and I read about authors who said that characters will take a life of their own, and it just seemed too romantic to me when I heard that. But once I started to write, it was the most extraordinarily battle I had to
letting the characters
Yes.
lead you on your journey.
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
getting him back in line.
All right. Where can we learn more about your book?
Well, I have a Facebook page called Glenfiddich, and hopefully this will be on it as well. But I also have it. It's on Amazon. It's both in Kindle version and paperback and iBooks as well. And there's a fair number of reviews of it, which I found interesting because we all probably had that experience of some of the things that were highlighted in the reviews were things I never thought about.
Well, I need to add something here because I forgot the title to the book we were talking about, which was Great Joys and Deep Sorrows. And that was by Sonia Leeson-Cahalan. All right, I had to bring that up.
Yes.
Because she'll kill me if I don't. All right. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Aspects of Writing with me, your host, James Kelly. Our co-host, our co-panelists are Vicki-Ann Bush and Janet Corsi. Our guests are authors Alan Geik and Cher Chidzey. And the topic is writing about cultural differences. And both Cher's book is definitely about cultural differences. And you talked about, Alan, how yours has a little bit of diversity in there when it comes to cultural differences.
Yeah, America has always been, when you're talking about inner cities in America, whether now or 200 years ago, they were always filled. That's where immigrants flowed to. And the beginning of World War I, as I mentioned before, had large German and Irish populations that were at odds with each other and at odds with a government attempt to get us involved on the British side of the war.
Well, I want to bring something up since we're talking about cultural differences. And I know, Cher, you can relate to this for the simple reason that you moved from Singapore to Australia. I know someone who actually came over here when she was in her 30s to the United States from Germany. And she is white. And what I find remarkable or interesting about this character, who's much older now, she's in her 80s, is that she's constantly reminding me if she sees someone who's of Hispanic descent or of Indian descent, or she's going, well, she's a foreigner, or wonder where she's from. And I said, but how do you know she's a foreigner? She could have been born here in America.
Yeah.
People don't understand that America's not just white.
Right.
You know, there are people.
Right.
I have a friend who grew up in East LA who, for 5 generations, lived in LA. 5 generations, understand this. But there are certain sections in America to this day, in fact, I know one in Miami, where sometimes people stay within their own communities. And his family was Hispanic, and his parents just spoke Spanish, even though they were 5th generation. Mm-hmm. And he was a member of a gang, part of a hood, and he had decided he didn't understand why. He felt safe there, believe it or not, but he didn't understand why, but he thought there's got to be something better out there. So he actually stepped outside the circle, and he came to Las Vegas, found a job, put himself through college. And one by one, his brothers and sisters did the same thing.
Wow.
Because to them, the only culture they understood was East LA, where they grew up.
Yeah.
And 5th generation. But what we don't understand is that, yes, they may speak Hispanic, may speak Spanish, and maybe his parents only spoke Spanish, but they're American. Mm-hmm. They've been here their entire life.
Yeah.
And we forget that just because someone's of a different skin color or different looking, they're still could be American. They were born here. There's generations born here. The Irish came over here as an immigrant. Mm-hmm.
Right.
The Italians came over here as immigrants.
That's what I was just going to say.
you know,
I
we're
mean,
all immigrants.
my family, Italian, back to my, grandmother, they were not considered white.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
They were not
Yeah.
considered white. So
Well, having the same color doesn't mean they have the same culture.
Exactly.
Exactly.
That's a good way of
Right.
putting it, Cher.
Right.
That's
These are
exactly right.
Totally different values.
Correct.
I was asked the same question on Radio National in Australia, and I say, well, you got the British coming coming to study. Friends of mine who were English, they're bullied in school. The same white skin, but human beings are funny.
Yeah.
They see something different and they pick on it.
Right.
And
Yes.
that's what we should work on. That's what I say. Work on the differences. You don't have to accept everything. You can agree to disagree.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
right.
Assimilation does not mean one way.
Well, and
It
what's
is take and give.
And what's interesting too is, and I know, Alan, you know this because you've written about World War I. In World War II, they actually had the internment camps.
And yes, and it was only for. It's interesting to me because it was for Japanese Americans who
Right.
had been here
Right.
many generations,
Right.
who were 100% American. They supported American causes, whereas in New York City, they were German Nazi groups in Madison Square Garden who were giving Heil Hitler signs. Who nothing happened to them.
Right.
They
Yeah.
were on the street throughout World War II
Yeah.
when the Japanese were sent to internment camps when, in fact, they were never showing any outward display of
Right.
anti-Americanism. And the only reason for that was because of race.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Their look.
It hurts
Yeah.
my brain.
Yeah.
And you
Yes,
know what?
That's your brain.
It
right.
does. It hurts
Yeah.
my brain.
And since we're talking about cultural, I worked with someone at one point here in Las Vegas who was from Bosnia, and I had a lesson there in that, that was part of Yugoslavia. They were broken up to 7 small countries, and those countries are constantly feuding with each other. And what I found remarkable is that this woman lost her husband to the war, and she raised her son in a concentration camp. For 7 years, she lived in this concentration camp. Now, what was unique about that one is that she was there to protect her and her child. So she was allowed to leave during the day to go work. Her son stayed in the camp, but it was more a way of protecting her and her family from
Right.
But we don't think about this could even happen today, but it does. It still goes on today.
Yep.
We still have these cultural differences. We still have slaughtering going on. It's amazing to me how we have to look at each other as being so different. And I think that's one thing about being a writer that helps, because we can send messages out through what we write. We can actually show and educate people on these cultural differences. I feel very fortunate that I've worked on other people's books who are from other countries, because it actually awakened my perspective on who they are and why they think the way they do. I think that's one of the greatest lessons we can have, is learning and understanding each other. And not just necessarily culturally, but even when it comes to religions, sometimes you're going to learn something that you may not have realized. We talked about this before going on air. We were talking about a friend of mine who was from the Middle East,
Right.
who was a Maronite. And people don't understand that the Maronites are part of the Catholic Church, and that there was 800,000 Maronites. There are 800,000 Maronites in Beirut. We think that everything is the same, whether they be Muslims or Christians. It's not always set in stone the way we imagine it to be.
Right.
And we need to open our minds to that. As writers, we need to open our minds to that, so that when we're writing something, we're more accurate. And that's what I like to do anyway, is when you're writing about something, Alan, do you study it? Do you go to the internet? What do you do?
Oh, yeah. I mean, research when you're writing about it, especially writing about another period, like in my case, World War I, almost everything had to be researched. What
Yeah.
kind of car, what kind of gear shift they had. I mean, it was, and I often wondered, how did people do this before the internet? They did.
Yeah.
I mean,
Called
It was
libraries.
called the
Libraries.
library.
The library. I was in the library too for a long time, looking through books. But it's amazing when you think of some of the extraordinary detail in books that were done 200 years ago. That
Very
just
true.
had extraordinary scholarship going on.
Cher, did you do any research for your book?
Stacks.
Stacks. Yeah.
Yes, and also it's because I've taught that many migrants. I absorb their experiences,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and try to see it through their eyes, see it through both sides,
Right.
basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think this process of merging of cultures is a give and take sort of business. You take what you want, what you think is suitable. There's no need to put others down. You can agree to disagree.
Right.
But
Right.
the main thing is to do not assume. If you're unclear, open up, talk about it. Nobody is going to, nobody is going to label you racist. And people put too much emphasis on food. You see, in Australia, the migrants' food is uh, been put up there as a great way for bonding. Yes, it is true. But I'll tell you a story about stinky tofu.
Sticky tofu. Okay.
Yeah, it really stinks. I tell you,
I
it
know.
really stinks. And it's only certain kind of people from China who like it. We grew up in Singaporeans and not used to it. But my sister spent 20 years in China. So when we're in Beijing, she brought out this jar of stinky tofu. And she said, try it. And the four sisters look at her and say, no, we're not going to try it. She said, you just have to pinch your nose and put your chopsticks. Once it enters your mouth, it's okay. So we spent 1 hour fighting over this jar of stinky tofu. So is it really that important that I have to like your food? No, I'll possibly throw up if I eat vinegar on chips because I don't like it.
Oh, I love vinegar.
Why
and
can't
chips.
it be frank? It's not because I hate your food. I like some other things. So it's a bit speak frankly, openly, honestly, and that moves the society, the harmonious side of it, forward.
You
And
know,
everybody's happier.
it's so funny you should talk about this, Cher, because we actually were talking about how I have a friend who is Jewish. They don't really normally eat, pork, but this person will eat bacon.
Yeah.
Not ham, no ham, but bacon. It is funny, and there should never be anything wrong with whatever we do in life, and you shouldn't be held to one standard either. If you're of a particular religion and you're not allowed to eat beef or you're not allowed to eat chicken or whatever it is, so what? As each generation goes on, I'm so glad for the new generations that are being brought up today.
Yes.
They're much more liberal thinking. They're not stuck to the confines of what we were taught necessarily.
Right.
And I think that's great. There's nothing wrong with trying different things, like you said, different foods. It makes us better as human beings, and it makes us understand each other better, So, anyone want to add to that?
Well, I know a bunch of millennials, and they have a very wide food palette that I never even dreamt of as a kid.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it's that the problem, or at least part of the problem is there's a difference in recognizing difference and accepting it than turning away from it. Meaning, people say, well, we're really not different. We are. We are.
Yeah.
We are
Well, yeah,
different.
we are.
But there is something that I kind of I watched the other day. It was an author on Facebook did this little thing and said, and I don't know if you saw it, but it was everybody goes to sleep.
Yeah.
Everybody
Yeah.
across the whole entire world
Goes to sleep.
goes to sleep. Everybody needs sleep. And I thought, oh my God, that's such a simple little thing, but it's so true.
Yep.
So we have this common thread, or these common threads, but we also have these differences. And that's great that we have these differences. And we should be able to accept or talk about them and not have it be like an earth-shattering thing that I don't like tofu or you don't like Italian food.
Yeah.
Everybody likes Italian
I
food.
have to tell you a quick story about tofu, though. This is how stupid I am. I was going to this vegan restaurant with some friends, and I went there the first time, and I ordered the chicken, Kung Pao chicken. That's what it was. Well, now they have a way of making tofu look like chicken.
Yes.
Now, I'm so stupid. Think about this. It's a vegan restaurant.
You thought you were
So I'm eating chicken, and I'd been there for the third time. And I go, oh, we got to have my favorite. My favorite is the Kung Pao chicken. And I mean, I don't know how they fix this chicken, but it's so good. And this person looked at me and said, what? I go, the chicken. They go, that's not chicken, that's tofu. I said, no, it's chicken. And I was insisting that it was chicken. And so they go, you're in a vegan restaurant. It's tofu. So then they call the waitress over. And she goes, no, sir, that's tofu. I mean, I like tofu.
Sounds like a cheap date.
Mock food is very common in Chinese vegetarian food as well.
Yeah.
Mock duck, mock fish, and mock everything.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to the diversity in writing, when we're going to talk about how culture differences can influence our writing, and to understand how we think culturally, here are a few examples of how culture can read and how we can write it. And Vicki-Ann, I'm going to let you start.
How and when specific languages started writing from right to left is still under debate. For example, Persian, which is a descendant of cuneiform,
Yes.
is written from right to left, even though its predecessor is not. This may be from particular historical circumstances, but there is no academic consensus on the exact reasons.
We talked about this as well. We talked about how, writing from left to right and right to left and from backwards to forward and forward. And I actually helped translate someone's book that way. And it's really difficult to understand how. I'm so glad I did that because it really helps me understand that culture that I would never have understood before. Because you got to understand that even when we're talking, let's just say they don't speak English and someone's translating to them. Even when they're translating to them in a different way in which I said it. Right. So they're thinking about what I said is different than the way I said it. It isn't until we learn the other language. And I know, Cher, you understand this. You speak English. And what other languages do you speak?
Just a little bit of Bahasa Melayu, Malay language, not much. I was quite ethnocentric, so I'm Chinese. I'm not going to learn Malay. So I was a little bit, I regretted it because it's supposed to be my national language, and I should have. It was my,
So you speak English?
I speak English. I went to English school, missionary school in Singapore. So the Irish nuns taught me.
See, we're getting a lesson right now.
So I speak Mandarin, the different Chinese dialects too. But otherwise, no. Other languages.
But when you're thinking one thing, I had a professor in college. I studied some German, and I had a German professor in college, and I remember him telling me the story. He spoke 8 languages fluently.
Wow.
And when he first came to America, one of the things that happened to him was, the first time he came to America and he got a job at one of the universities teaching German, is because he spoke 8 languages fluently. He was really tired because when you first come to America, you're all excited. You want to see everything. You want to do everything. And so he'd wore himself out. And he had this interview. And it was a panel of people sitting around a conference table. And he's sitting there and he's talking. And all of a sudden, all these people had this weird look on their face. And he's trying to figure out what's going on here. So then in different languages, he'd say, what language am I speaking? And they'd still have this puzzled face until they finally said it in English. And then they go, you're speaking English now. I mean, his mind was so tired. He didn't even know what he was saying, what language he was speaking.
What language he was using.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is funny because I think in literature in Chinese, but in scientific training, because I've never been to a Chinese school, I'm fully educated in English. So I would talk to my Chinese friend from Shanghai at uni when I was doing research on meteorology. They would say, speaking in Chinese, and all of a sudden a technical term came out, and this is the katabatic wind. And so all my friends would hear just the technical terms popping out here and there. So it is quite strange how we will train our mind on certain fields and certain aspects. We think in one language and then in another in a separate language.
And
Right.
you know,
Depending on
one of the things we have to keep in mind too when we're writing is, like, for instance, I remember I studied French as well in high school and in college, and I remember, well, and German in both high school and college. I'll go with the German because this one was a really good story. A friend of mine and I attended college together, and we were both in the same class. And I remember we were speaking what was called Lower German and didn't know it. And the professor that I had in high school, that's what she taught. She was from Munich. And then the professor I had in college was from Berlin. And they had a different dialect. And they had a different way of saying things. And he used to constantly pick us out and just see what we would say next so he could correct us for the rest of the class. And you know what's interesting? Even in the English language, this is true. Alan, you're from New York. And I know Vicki-Ann, you're from New York.
California.
Well, Jen's from California. She don't count.
we speak everything.
Right, they speak everything. But you know, the thing is that there are different accents no matter where you go, especially up in
Absolutely.
that region. And it's the same thing as going to the South. I lived in the South 12 years. Sometimes it's hard to understand some people, you know, what they're saying if they have a thick accent.
It's interesting you say that because sometimes people would say to me, am I fluent in Spanish? I speak really well. But I'd say, no, I'm not. And I'm not fluent in English either because if I was in a rugby locker room of players in Australia, I wouldn't
Right.
understand anything they were saying.
Right.
I mean,
right.
so it just speaks to what you were just saying, that in the South, I mean, you really have to hang in and translate into what you're used to.
We talked about on one show when you're writing, would you necessarily, let's say someone speaks Russian and you say they speak Russian, and would you start off with trying to create an accent for that character, but would you maintain that accent for that character throughout the book? And we had a little bit of debate there because this one person said, well, it's enough to introduce them to the character and show they have an accent or mention they have an accent, but you don't need to maintain that accent throughout the book at that point. I can understand that a little bit, I guess, because you want them to understand what you're writing or what you're trying to say or convey. But on the other hand, if you have someone from the South that talks with a twang, you do need to keep that character's perspective
Yes.
because he's going to
Right.
be talking
Yes.
differently than if you were, you know, speaking with a more fluent English.
When I wrote The Garden of Two, now that's another one for World War I. But what I did is I have a friend who's English, and because they were in the trenches with people from Britain, and I wanted this particular guy to speak like that because when you read it, it didn't say anything to you when you read it American. Does
Right.
that make sense?
Yeah.
So I had him read it, and then he told me the words to say and how to say it and how to write it. So this way, throughout, when they're talking with him, you realize you're talking to someone from England as opposed to someone from America.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because how would you understand then that they're talking to someone from somewhere else?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. So
you can only have an authentic voice if you stick to the accent
Right.
or the style of speaking. Like Singaporeans and Malaysians will always add a la at the end of the sentence.
Right.
So if you want to say something rude, you say da 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 la.
yeah.
Cher,
I quite.
I have a
Sorry?
question for you because I spent 2 years in Indonesia, and I learned a lot of the Bahasa, which you just referred to, and it's a language that has there's no conjugation of verbs, which we all learn in English and take for granted in other languages. There's a subject, you put one word in and it refers to the past, one word to the future. It was a great language to learn. Did you find that to be true as opposed to, say, learning another language?
I told you I was ethnocentric. I didn't learn much Malay.
Oh.
Bahasa Melayu. So
Oh,
I
I'm
stuck
s-
to my Chinese. I was
Oh.
very snobbish.
Oh. Okay.
Honesty for you, that's honesty.
Wait a minute there, Cher. That's that cultural thing. You need to be better.
No. No. But then I made amendments. I did a 1 year Bahasa Indonesian course in Melbourne Uni.
Okay.
You know, Cher, I want to ask you this because we do have friends in Australia. We've interviewed a few authors from Australia. And I'm just curious, how are you accepted in Australia? Because we were talking about how in America, people who are born here that have Japanese descent or Chinese descent or Italian descent, how we can sometimes look at them and think they're a foreigner when they're really not. They were born here. But how are you accepted in Australia? How is the culture different there? Because Australia is also made up of various cultures.
Sure. I had no problem at uni. That's where all the radicals, all the left-wing people were. But when I started my first job in the insurance company, there were really racist comments.
Really?
Really racist comments.
Oh, that's
And that's what I want to talk about. Microaggression is okay. A colleague of mine was staying in another room. That was at the end of the Vietnamese boat people coming here. There's still some coming, but not many. There was sort of orderly migration because the government organized it. But there's still some boats coming here. So I heard from the next room, drown them all. Drown them all. And I just went to pieces. I'm not Vietnamese.
Right.
Yeah, she's not talking to me. I can't call her racist. But that's still racial microaggression because it's pushing my button. It is doing something. It's through language or it's an assault on me because I'm colored.
Right.
But you can't call her racist because she's not talking to me even. How is that?
Well,
Yeah.
I hate to interrupt you here. Cher, I hate to interrupt you here, but we are down to the last minute of the show. So I want to thank Cher, Chidzey, and I'd also like to thank Alan Geik for being on the show with us.
Great pleasure to be.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you so much.
And real fast, Cher, where can we find your book?
With Amazon, with Kindle, and I have a King's Quest Facebook page.
Okay.
Great.
And what about for you, Alan?
Glenfiddich is on Amazon as both a paperback and a Kindle version, and it's also in iBook form.
And Vicki-Ann, real quick, you're an author as well. Where can we find your work?
Amazon and Barnes & Noble and my webpage.
And Jan?
Barnes & Noble and over the headboard of my bed.
All right. You can find the video of our past shows on youtube.com. Just go to youtube.com/aspects of writing. Or you can go to our website, aspectsofwriting.com. There, all the links to all the shows that are archived are there. There you will find shows for iHeartRadio, or the archive shows links for iHeartRadio, iTunes, Roku TV, AMFM247.com. We're live on AM247.com on Saturdays at 1 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Sometimes, most of the time, we're on Blog Talk Radio Sunday nights at 9 o'clock. And you can also find all the shows are archived on Aspects of Writing. There's an archive link on the Aspects of Writing. Just click on that tab. It'll take you to the audio version. In addition, you can hear the show on Blog Talk Radio. I mentioned that. We do a show on Sunday nights, and then we do another show on Wednesday nights. So does anyone have any questions real quick before we go off air?
No, it was nice talking with you, Cher.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank
Cher.
you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
joining
Thank
us.
you for having me.
All right, so this is your host, James Kelly, saying until next week, if you can dream it, you can write it. Thank you, everyone, for being on the show.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, kiddo.
Thank you.